Alrighty, quick thumbs up. Hear me okay? Audio is all fine? Wonderful. Okay, so as far as I see this debate, it basically breaks down to whether or not we should make political bribery legal, which I think it should not be. So I'm interested to hear from your side of the house whether or not there is just some counter-analysis for the past, century of US policy, or just some reason why we should allow the political system to be bought. So I think the first thing to note here is just the process that goes through about why political donations, specifically from corporations, enables corporations to have so much power and what the harms from that arise, right? So first thing to note is that corporations primarily act out of a profit incentive. They need to be able to satiate their shareholders, which means that any kind of money that they spend is something that is going to further their benefits, and they're not going to do anything unless it is something that leads back to a growing bottom line for them. So ultimately, when corporations do give political donations, it is done with this in mind, with trying to eventually further more money for themselves going down the line. And the way that happens is that they donate to a candidate, or oftentimes both candidates on either side of the political divide, so that they can have influence no matter who actually ends up getting into office. And then there is the tacit assumption with this donation that unless that candidate passes policy that is beneficial for the corporation, doing things like lowering tax rates for them, deregulating their particular industry, and otherwise just allowing them to get away with basically whatever they want, then that money is going to be pulled. And obviously these candidates have an incentive to try to maintain that flow of income, because that income allows them to buy campaign spots and campaign ads, which helps them get votes, which helps them get elected. The problem with this also is that it functions in a kind of circular nature, where these candidates then get elected, they then pass this legislation that enables those corporations to have more money, and then that more money means that they can donate higher amounts of money to the campaign, which means that there is less of an incentive for these campaigners to actually violate that kind of tacit agreement that has happened with those corporations, which means that they just get more and more political power. So the effects of this are twofold. One is that it fundamentally undermines the tenet of democracy, insofar as that you have not the interests of the kind of regular rest of society being represented, but specifically the interests of the corporations, and that you can see this in effects of things like a shrinking middle class in America, rising house prices that we have in Australia as a failure to deregulate things like negative gearing, and also things like Monsanto slipping pieces of legislation into budget bills and stuff like this. But the second thing that it does is that it forces parties to differentiate themselves on the margins, because when both parties are taking money from corporations, it's very hard to call out the other party and say that you're being corrupt or that you're being bought. And so they end up spending a lot of time on pointless shit like same-sex marriage, when really that's something that should be passed, and we can get on to talking about bigger issues. So those are my opening statements. I'll pass the mic over to you.
So I think a couple of things in response to that, and then I think it's valuable to redefine parts of this debate. So firstly, a lot of what you said would be true if it weren't also possible for the people running these corporations to then donate of themselves, because I think that's likely what's going to happen. If you ban corporations from making these donations, what's likely to happen is the people who run those corporations aren't going to not donate at all. They're going to donate individually, and I think that comes up with its own problems, which I'll go into later. But in terms of kind of restructuring the debate, I think I don't think it's fair to specifically restrict this to donations to, say, parties or candidates. I think if you're going to ban political donations, you also then need to ban political donations to anything that's being politicized. The reason being is because corporations, if they can't donate to, say, a candidate, then they'll donate to a cause that a candidate supports, and then they'll get those same harms that you just talked about. Likely, that looks like, say, the same-sex marriage campaign, or say Mardi Gras, where ANZ would donate to Mardi Gras for that purpose, and then they still get that, and then they endorse candidates who also endorse Mardi Gras, and I think all of those problems still accrue when you do that, and so for those benefits or those problems that you want to prevent from happening, you need to prevent all political donations in any capacity, not just to candidates. In terms of I suppose that's mainly the responsive stuff I have to say to that. I think the processes of like trying to donate in their own interest, I think that's fine. But I also think at the point where we vote within our own interests and we use the capital that we have to further our own interests, I don't think that's necessarily a problem, given that they have the capacity to do this, and restricting them is not so much restricting their freedom of expression, so to say, but it's also kind of preventing them from helping get their own interests into politics, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing. While some of the policies that they do aren't necessarily good, I don't think we should then restrict all of these corporations from doing that and then acting against their interests just because, it can lead to some bad things. And so I think with 30 seconds left, I'm not going to go into like a point, but that's kind of, I guess, my opening statement there. So I'll pass it back to you and then we'll get into some substantive, hopefully.
Okay, sure. So a couple of responses. The first thing that you bring up is this idea that if we ban corporations from donating, then the owners of those corporations are just going to be able to donate themselves. A couple of things to say on that. Firstly, is I think that it's principally consistent for me to just support a wide range of banning of political donations. I think that a completely ideal system would probably be something where donations are capped to quite a low amount, something like, $27 as championed by the Bernie campaign, maybe some input from sponsored for various parties, like a system that we have here in Australia. And I would be happy to stand behind a widespread array of policies that try to remove money from politics. The reason why I think that I'm just speaking about corporations is firstly, it's the topic that we were assigned. But secondly, I think given that they make a vast majority of the money, that they're a benefit, it's beneficial to try to target them specifically. Secondly, the thing to say is that just because something is hard to do does not mean that it is inherently bad to do. And I'll deal with your points later about why this is, I don't think that you provide an adequate analysis about why this is in fact something that is justifiable. I think that the harms are quite self-evident from that. Second thing that to deal with is you're saying, well, if they can't donate to the campaigners specifically, they'll just donate to causes that they agree with. A couple of responses to this. The first thing to say is that there's less of a clear link there, because having a cause that an individual party supports, often they're supporting that cause because supporting that cause is something that gains them political power. So they don't actually have anything to gain from another corporation also supporting that cause, something like the same-sex marriage Vote Yes campaign. And so there's less of a problem there in terms of the ways in which corporations can actually influence the political system. But second thing that I would say is that if it was the case that we just got to channel all of the political donations out of policy into particular causes, and I think that provides some kind of benefit, because in championing those, that's just like a kind of marketing way up that those politicians make, where they try to champion particular causes in order to get people on side to then come and buy that product. And to the degree that they cause some kind of social utility by benefiting those causes, and that people can decide that that's enough of a social utility that they then want to curry favor for that, that's a fair trade-off. I'm fine for it to go in that direction. The second, in dealing with about why this is principally wrong, is saying that, like, look, well, people are allowed to act in their own self-interest and that we would allow them to do that, right? The problem with it isn't that corporations are acting in their own self-interest, although sometimes it is when the kind of policy that it leads to is stuff like deregulation of the financial market that causes global recessions that cause thousands of people to lose their jobs. But it's more specifically about the fact that within a democracy, there is a premise that no one person's voice should be any particular louder than another. Nobody gets to have 10 votes or 20 votes or 50 votes, depending where they are in society. By allowing corporations to donate in the way that they do, it is them that is dictating the policy platform. It is not up to the democratic will. So this goes beyond simply championing their own self-interest. It goes to actively undermining the democratic process and ignoring the democratic process in order to be able to get things that benefit them to the exclusion of other people.
Okay, so I want to firstly deal with this idea that, like, the social utility of then donating to causes is some form of benefit that you want to cop. I don't think that that's how this is actually going to work, given that politicians also quite often backflip on these causes just so that they can get votes. See the Libs Nats voting yes, see Bill Shorten and the Labour Party backflipping just to get votes. I think at that point, then they are only doing it to get that funding and to act in their interest. And I think they're still doing the same thing, donating to corporations that looks like ANZ supporting same-sex marriage, and then being able to differentiate from other banks and saying, well, we are the ones who support this, they don't. And the other example I think is worth noting here is the split of the banks on the Adani campaign, where they can differentiate and say, well, we supported this, but you didn't. And so I think that's the thing there. And then it just becomes, creates these causes that are then political tools just to gain votes, insofar as big banks saying that they're not supporting the Adani campaign, whereas CommBank is, and then politicians jumping on that and using that to get votes. And I think that's far more harmful than corporations donating specifically to that politician. But in terms of, like, some of this substantive, I think the point that I was making in terms of whether or not some people should have a bigger or smaller voice than others, I don't think that's a good enough reason to stop corporations donating, particularly when a lot of the people in politics itself will have bigger voices, and that looks like different parties already just having bigger funding without these corporations. They are always going to have bigger voices. And I think the harm with that is that it means that without these donations, regardless of who they're donating to, that dichotomy of big voice versus small voice is always going to exist. That looks like parties that don't accept corporations. That looks like parties who don't get the corporations, or parties who are smaller. And then even without these donations are still competing with bigger parties. At this point in Australia, it looks like they're going against the Liberals, who even without those donations, the Liberals would still have substantially more funding to do that. And I think, so that point about like big voice versus small points, it isn't a justifiable reason to stop corporations, because that's still going to happen anyway. But I also think even if you want to restrict individuals from donating, I think it's far harder to stop that, given that it is easier to hold corporations accountable for the transparency of their donations than an individual. It is far easier for an individual to donate under the radar, or to evade this investigation as to how much money they've given to a certain thing. They do that anyway. I think it's far easier to hold corporations accountable to that, and I'll get more into that in the next segment.
Cool. All right. So a couple again responses on the causes thing. Like, the first thing to note here is that I just don't think in the grand scheme of things that this is really like that big of an issue. Like, if in fact we end up channeling a bunch of money from being political donations into causes, and that is the new political axis that it's fight about, like the fact that corporations then go to donating to a particular campaign or something, like, just doesn't actually strike me as something that's important, when the harms that I have provided to you is things like, you know, a deregulation of the market, which led to like a global financial crisis. The thing like Monsanto being able to slip lines of text into budget bills so that they can do things like claim copyrights on genetic material, right? Like, on the just scale of like importance of those things, having some kind of shift around to various or the like politicizing of charity campaigns just doesn't seem that prevalent to me, right? But also, you've never really explained the mechanism about why shifting those things still means that the political the process remains the same, because I provided the analysis to you that when corporations now donate to these causes instead of the politicians don't have a relationship to that cause apart from the fact that they are backing it in order to get votes. So it doesn't change the calculus or the policy, you know, making decisions of those of the politicians whatsoever now, depending on which corporation supports what particular area. And so you massively get rid of the problem that I've identified, where corporations are basically able to dictate the kind of policy that gets written. The last thing I want to say is, like, you know, oh, they're politicizing these areas and stuff, right? Like, I think that these are areas that are fair enough to be politicized. Like, if someone wants to distinguish themselves by saying, we don't back Adani being a major mining corporation here in Australia for our American listeners, right? And that's the point where people want to distinguish themselves on. I think that that is a perfectly legitimate area to try to draw that separation, to say we support this development or we don't support this development, right? So lastly, I just want to deal with your quote about like bigger party, that bigger voices and disparate voices already exist in politics. Again, like, the fact that another problem exists is not a reason to support a problem that already exists in itself, unless you can show that that thing is not in itself a problem. But the difference obviously between, like, you know, different parties and different politicians have bigger voices than the average citizen is, firstly, like, the analysis that you missed there is that the difference of the voices that corporations are directly getting to write the policy, which is not something that the individual has access to, but also the politicians are held accountable to their constituents in the way that corporations simply aren't. So that when the politician drafts a bad piece of policy, they are subsequently voted out. When a corporation, you know, writes their own legislation, yeah, they cop a bit of backlash, but business keeps going on as usual, and then they just fund the next person that gets into office and still get their way. So obviously there's just not a comparison that's able to be made there.
Sure. So I think in terms of the analysis that I missed there, I would say that the reason why I would support corporations still being able to do this is, again, because they are far more accountable than sliding that money into politicians' pockets without being held accountable to that. And even if corporations are able to slip their lines of legislation into the bills that are passed through Parliament, it is far easier for people to scrutinise that and then pick it up than it is for them to for individual people to go off the radar and do that. And I think individual people already do that. But I also think at the point where, again, if you have those politicians who do have a lot more funding and money than other people see Donald Trump versus other politicians in America, then I think that that big versus little voice, without those corporations who may donate to his opponents, then it means that Donald Trump's voice and the Republicans' voice is always going to be bigger than all of his, particularly because you've got his own funding, which even without political donations, then that's still going to be a thing. And that is a thing that we recognize. We already know that some parties do have bigger funding. And at that point, then that becomes an issue because it just exacerbates it, because obviously corporations don't always go for one side, for one particular side. And then at that point, it can become a political tool when one corporation is saying could potentially back a side which does not have as much funding behind it, and then differentiate themselves and that side of politics against, say, I don't know, just throwing random companies out. The Combank supporting the Liberals, already knowing that the Liberals have that funding and they don't need those donations. And so the next thing I wanted to go through is that even if corporations are doing this not particularly good, I would say that given that they are made up of those individual people and they are representing the interests of that particular person as well as the corporation, i.e. the board members, that is still not a reason that we should prevent them from donating, particularly because, as I said earlier, it is far likely that they will find ways to donate anyway, in the same way that they find ways to slide money out of their accounts and put it into, say, offshore things, or do it on the sly so that they don't get that. And that's likely to happen anyway, in the same way that, say, Microsoft might not particularly donate $1 billion to, say, Hillary Clinton, but it is far easier for Bill Gates to donate $1 billion on the sly to that campaign. And that's what's likely to happen, because at that point, they still want to act within their interests, and they're likely to keep doing that. And yeah, pass it back, yay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so just, again, dealing with this, like, they're likely to do it anyway, and so we shouldn't stop them. Like, you just realize that what a ridiculous argument that is when applied to literally anything else. It's like, we can't stop 100% of murders, so we should just legalize murder because they're going to do it anyway, right? Like, obviously there are impacts to making it illegal. The first is that you probably just get less of it because it's the case that things are harder to do when they're illegal. The second thing to note is that when it becomes identified that someone has done something illegal, they can get, like, you know, they have broken the law, and thus criminal or legal punishments can come down on that person. So if you make corporate donations illegal, then the candidates who still continue to take money from corporate donors are now being labeled as taking illegal bribery, corruption, and then that's something that gets them out of office and starts to get it into more representative. Just the idea that this is something that's going to be hard to enforce is not a good enough reason to not do it in the first place, right? Secondly, I wanted to talk about this idea about how corporations but even if it's the case that, you know, for some reason we would ban corporations but not try to close the loopholes that allow them to do that, right? That corporations are more accountable than individuals. The thing that I would note here is that, firstly, we just haven't seen that accountability work in any kind of manifest way. People have been calling out money in politics for decades in all kinds of Western democracies, and we haven't seen any kind of substantial change. And the reasons for that are a couple of fold. First is that it's very hard for the candidates themselves to call other candidates out, because as I noted at the start of this debate, the corporations are giving money to both sides because they like to hedge their bets that whatever candidate gets in, they still have the influence in power. So you can't differentiate yourself and say you're taking money from Goldman Sachs when the response is, oh wait, I'm also taking money from Goldman Sachs, right? But also it means that there's no alternative in the voting, right? Like the basic the perfect case that we saw is in the recent US presidential election between Hillary and Trump, right? Where it's like, at the point at which you had that general election, there was no vote in there unless you wanted to vote for an independent candidate, which because of the system was someone that was never going to get in. If you wanted to vote against corporatism, if you wanted to vote against the influence of money in politics, if you wanted to vote against people like Goldman Sachs, there was just no way to be able to do that because both the candidates were supported by that. So obviously there is a difference between, the accountability of elected representatives and the accountability that is held to corporations, and is something that is far more true under elected representatives than is the case under corporations. Last thing I wanted to deal with is this contention that people are always going to have louder voices in politics, right? Like, there are some cases, however, where that's just legitimate, right? Like, if it's the case that the Republicans have more of a voice in the US Parliament than Vermin Supreme, even though they run on a same level of legitimacy in terms of what they propose, then the fact that more people are interested in the Republican Party and more people manage to support them means that they have legitimately bought their way to that bigger voice because they are representing more constituents when they speak in Parliament. That is the way that democracy ought run. Having a bigger voice that is brought to you by the benefit of having a lot of money is not.
I mean, but that might be true. But when you still have people who are running when you still have people that are running politics, i.e. business people who have that money, then that is not a metric that is not true democracy, simply because Donald Trump using his billions and billions of dollars to fund his campaign, as opposed to that independent who has no money whatsoever. I don't think that's a good enough reason for that to go on. And so to go through some of the responses, or to go through a lot of the responsive material that I have here, in terms of candidates accountability versus corporate accountability, at the point where candidates no longer have that corporate entity behind them, then they're likely to look for those donations in other places, or to use political maneuvering to get that anyway. And so I think what's likely to happen, and I've just lost my train of thought. Yeah, good job, Josh. So yeah, look, actually, I'm going to pass it back because I actually have no responses at the moment. And so just in the interest of keeping the debate going, I'm going to do that.
I'll deal with some of the stuff that you did manage to bring up. So again, you've identified that there is a problem insofar as that people who are currently running for office who have large amounts of personal wealth themselves, i.e. the Clintons, i.e. Donald Trump, inherently have more of an advantage than people like Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein, because they are even if we were to ban something like corporate donations, they are able to fund themselves out of their own pocket. So we both agreed in this debate that disparate amounts of funding is the kind of thing that causes problems in politics. Whereas I stand for something that would actually try to fix that or take a step towards that. The counter action of well, this is always going to be a problem, so we should just let people do it anyway, does nothing to actually kind of address that problem. The point that I think that you are alluding to in terms of political maneuvering is that, if this is an axis along which people can no longer negotiate or try to make some kind of calculus, then they're just going to default to some other kind of ways to be able to get political maneuvering. Maybe they'll just default to demagoguery or populism and just try to do whatever, is going to short-term get the most votes, all those sorts of things. The difference between that and being able to make calculus as along which corporations have donated which is that one of those things is at least semi-legitimate insofar as that you are representing the views of the people and you are fulfilling the purpose of democracy, in that what the majority of the people want is the kind of policy that you enact, versus when you are not doing that and you are writing the kinds of policy that in fact is very unpopular in most of the country, but you are doing so because the whims of the people that have donated you and given you all this money to the campaign dictate that this is something that you ought to, right? So if it is the case that by banning political donations, we manage to move the spectrum where instead of now making policy calculus on the grounds of who has donated to you, and instead making policy calculus on the grounds of what is popular at the time, I would say that that is a benefit that I am able to claim, because doing what is popular at the time fulfills the purpose of democracy, whereas doing the other thing doesn't. I'll pass it back to you before I have a minute for closing statements and stuff.
I'll try not to introduce too much new stuff just because you've only got a minute left. So just to respond to the stuff that you just brought out. So in terms of fulfilling the views of the most people, I think at the point where these corporations are still representing the people that work for them, I still think that that is a somewhat sufficient reason. You can shake your head at that as much as you want, but given that the people who run these corporations still have their interests catered to, and to say to speak to this in terms of corporations not always doing things in the interest of all the people that work for them. I mean, bigger corporations just can't do that anyway. I would say that at the point where these people are acting within their own interests, I would rather a world where corporations did it rather than that political maneuvering getting it from other places, given that there are probably far more harmful ways. And I'll try and think of that while I get through the rest of this. I think, but in terms of this idea of personal wealth, I think that is far more harmful than using corporate donations. And the reason being is because when you use your political wealth, there is no accountability for that whatsoever. So if Donald Trump wants to spend $20 billion on his campaign, then then he can do that because he's not accountable to anyone else. At the point where a corporation donates $20 billion to a particular campaign or whatever, then they are then accountable to their stakeholders, to the people who buy into that corporation. At that point, then there is some form of being able to limit that, given that if the majority of their consumers, have an issue with that, then the trade-off is that they just stop buying that product. And then even if that corporation gets their interest represented in politics, then they lose out on those consumers. And so I think at that point, that is far better, particularly when even if we do ban this and it continues to happen anyway, I would say, even if that's not the best reason for doing this, that is still likely to happen. And for that reason, I would prefer a world where corporations are held to higher accountability, because even if it is illegal, as you said earlier in this speech, and you can hold them to that legal standard, I don't think that that's going to actually stop them in the same way that big corporations still do things like tax fraud, tax evasions, despite the fact that that is also illegal. Corporations, if it is within their interest to do illegal things and they can get away with that in some capacity, then they will do that. And I'll pass it back to you.
So it's never the contention that it was completely going to stop them. The contention is that it was going to lessen the problem as well. And if we regret things like tax fraud existing, the fact that corporations are able to draft legislation in the way that I have outlined is one of the ways that makes closing those tax loopholes much, much harder. So this is obviously something that we should enforce. Look, in closing, I'm going to respond to some of your stuff about supporting the interests of their employees and things like that by just reiterating some of the analysis that I brought to you first. And that is that corporations have a profit incentive in every action that they take. And if they do not act on that profit incentive, then the CEOs get voted out by the shareholders. So anytime that these donations are being made, they're not along principled grounds, they're not along ideological grounds, they are done on the basis that corporations understand that by doing so, they're going to be able to deregulate their market, lower their tax threshold, and ultimately make themselves more money. That fundamentally undermines the principles of democracy and means that ordinary working class people are left without a voice. This is an abhorrent bastardization of the political process and something that we should take active steps to prevent.
Okay, I'm also just not going to use the rest of the time just because I'm going to sum it up. I think in terms of this profit incentive, I think what's likely to what needs to be said is that individuals will still do that anyway. Corporations will still act within their profit. If it means that they're not donating specifically to these corporations, they're still going to endorse those candidates. They're still going to be doing those things at that point. Even if it's not an actual donation, they're still going to be publicly coming out in support of that. And this probably should have come out earlier, but cool. At that point, then you still have that issue where corporations are acting within their own interests at the detriment of the democratic process, because supporting Hillary Clinton and using a marketing campaign for that without actually donating to that still means that you get those harms. I think in terms of lessening the problem, I think to some extent it might lessen the problem, but also means that corporations are still going to do it anyway. I think at that point you may lessen it to some degree, but the cop-out is that corporations will still be doing it on the sly. And at the point where they can get away with doing it on the sly, it's more likely to not actually stop them. Or if they can get away with giving $1 billion, then they might push for $1.5 billion to $2 billion and just keep pushing it by doing it on the sly. And I think in summary, I would say at this point, then I still support a world where corporations are able to make some political donations, given everything in this debate. But also, yay, cool, good job, everyone.